America keeps its history in buildings, in documents behind glass, in dates carved into stone. It is a country that believes in records, facts, and things that can be explained and filed away. But inside those records are strange connections that do not sit quietly. A president's son keeps appearing near assassinations. A writer describes a disaster before it happens. A number follows a space mission until everything goes wrong. Maybe all of it is just chance. But some details are so specific that they make history feel less like random events and more like something written before it happened. These are real stories from American history that feel almost like glitches in the Matrix. 1. The son history wouldn't leave alone. Robert Todd Lincoln was not a president. He was not an assassin. He was not a man chasing fame. But somehow, his life kept touching the darkest moments in American presidential history. He was the oldest son of Abraham Lincoln, and being Lincoln's son already came with a heavy shadow. His father led America through the Civil War. His family lived inside the White House during one of the most painful times in the country's history. Then came the night of April 14, 1865. Abraham Lincoln went to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Robert was invited to go with him, but he did not go. He stayed behind. That small choice saved him from seeing the shooting with his own eyes. But it did not save him from the pain. After John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln, the wounded president was carried across the street to the Peterson House. Robert rushed there after hearing the news. He was beside his father when Abraham Lincoln died the next morning. For most people, that would be enough tragedy for one lifetime. But 16 years later, history came back. In 1881, Robert Todd Lincoln was serving as Secretary of War under President James Garfield. On July 6th, Garfield was at a train station in Washington, D.C. He was getting ready to leave for a trip. Robert Lincoln was also there. He was walking toward Garfield when a man named Charles Guiteau came from behind and shot the president. Robert was about 40 feet away. According to the National Park Service, he reached Garfield within seconds. He helped take control of the scene. He called for a doctor. He ordered soldiers to protect the area. But while he was doing all of that, one memory must have returned. His own father had also been shot by an assassin. Now, another president was lying wounded in front of him. Garfield did not die right away. He lived for weeks. But on September 19, 1881, he died from his wounds and infection. Once again, Robert Lincoln had been close to a president's death. And then, 20 years later, it happened again. In 1901, Robert and his family were traveling to Buffalo, New York. They planned to visit the Pan American Exposition, a large World's Fair. But when their train arrived, someone handed Robert a telegram. President William McKinley had been shot earlier that day. Robert was not standing beside McKinley when the bullets were fired. That part is often exaggerated online. But he was in Buffalo. He went to visit the wounded president. At first, McKinley seemed like he might survive. Then, days later, he died. 3 presidents: Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley. And somehow, Robert Todd Lincoln's life touched all 3 tragedies. Now, the logical explanation is simple. Robert Lincoln was born into one of America's most powerful families. He served in government. He moved around presidents, cabinet members, and important public events. So yes, he was more likely than a normal person to be near presidents. That part makes sense. But the feeling of the story does not go away so easily. Because this was not just one strange connection. It happened across decades. It followed him from his father's deathbed, to a train station, to another wounded president in Buffalo. This does not prove a curse. It does not prove fate. But it does show how real history can sometimes line up in a way that feels too neat, too dark, and too strange to ignore. Robert spent most of his life trying to be more than Abraham Lincoln's son. History had other plans. It remembered him as the man who kept standing near the moment America lost its presidents. 2. The Booth who saved a Lincoln. Edwin Booth was one of the most famous actors in America. In the 1860s, people lined up to watch him perform, and he had spent years building that reputation. Then his younger brother destroyed all of it in one night. On April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth walked into Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and shot President Abraham Lincoln. The name Booth went from celebrated to cursed almost overnight. Edwin had nothing to do with the assassination. He did not know about it. He did not plan it. But the name was shared, and in America, that was enough to change everything. Edwin stopped performing for months. He withdrew from public life. He carried the shame of what his brother had done, even though his own hands were clean. But there was one part of his life that made this story even stranger. Before John Wilkes Booth killed Abraham Lincoln, Edwin Booth had saved the life of Abraham Lincoln's son. It happened at a train station in Jersey City, New Jersey. The exact date is uncertain, but most accounts place it around 1863 or 1864. Robert Todd Lincoln was on the platform, waiting near a train car. The station was crowded. People were trying to buy sleeping car tickets and board the train. At some point, Robert was pushed by the crowd and lost his footing. The train began to move, and he slipped into the narrow gap between the platform and the train car. For a moment, he could not pull himself out. Then someone reached down, grabbed him by the coat collar, and pulled him back to safety before the train could crush him. That person was Edwin Booth. Robert Todd Lincoln recognized him right away. Edwin Booth was famous, and his face was well known. Robert later wrote about the incident in a letter, explaining that he turned to thank the man who saved him and saw that it was Edwin Booth. But Edwin did not know who Robert was. He had saved a young man on a train platform and walked away without knowing that the man was the president's son. So the timeline looks like this. Edwin Booth saved Robert Lincoln's life sometime in late 1864 or early 1865. Then, a short time later, Edwin's brother took Robert's father's life. One Booth saved a Lincoln. Another Booth killed a Lincoln. And they did it within months of each other. Edwin Booth learned about the connection later, that the young man he had pulled from the train tracks was the son of the president his brother would soon murder. There is no clear record of exactly how he felt when he found out. But people who knew him said it was one of the few things that brought him some peace during those years. That in the middle of everything his family's name had done, he had at least saved one life. The logical side of this is not hard to explain. America in the 1860s was a small world at the top. Famous actors, politicians, and their families crossed paths at train stations, theaters, and public events. Two men from powerful circles ending up on the same platform was not impossible. But the connection between the two families runs deeper than a chance meeting at a station. One brother saves a son. One brother kills a father. The same last name, the same months, the same family on both sides. History does not always line up this cleanly. When it does, it is hard to look at it and feel nothing. 3. The war that followed one man home. Wilmer McLean was not a general. He was not a president. He was not one of the men making the big decisions that pushed America into war. He was a retired wholesale grocer who owned land in Northern Virginia, and all he wanted was to live quietly on it. History did not let him. In July 1861, McLean and his family were living on a plantation near Manassas, Virginia. The Civil War had already begun a few months earlier at Fort Sumter, but the country had not yet seen what a large battle would really look like. Many people still believed the fighting might be short. Some even treated the coming battle almost like a public event. Then the armies arrived near Manassas. McLean's house was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The first Battle of Bull Run was fought near Manassas, Virginia, and part of the fighting took place on and around McLean's farm. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard used the home as a headquarters. According to accounts from the time, a shell crashed into the kitchen area while Confederate officers were eating. His land was crossed by soldiers, and his property became part of one of the first major battles of the war. The war had reached his doorstep before most of America had even accepted how serious it would become. So McLean made a decision. By late 1863, McLean and his family had settled in Appomattox Courthouse, a small village in south-central Virginia. It was far from Manassas. It was quieter. It looked like the kind of place where a man could keep his family away from the fighting and rebuild a normal life. For a while, that decision seemed to work. Then, on April 9, 1865, a Confederate officer knocked on his door. General Robert E. Lee needed a place to meet with Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War was ending. Lee was ready to surrender, and the two generals needed somewhere quiet and private to sign the terms. Someone had already looked at one house in the village and found it unsuitable. McLean's house was suggested next. McLean opened his door, he let them in, and in his front parlor, on that same afternoon, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, effectively ending the Civil War. McLean himself reportedly said afterward, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor." Whether those were his exact words or a later retelling, the fact behind them is real. Both events are documented. Both happened on his property. The dates, the locations, and the names are all part of the historical record. The straightforward explanation is simple. Appomattox Courthouse was chosen for practical reasons. It was in the right location at the right moment. Grant's officers were not looking for symbolism. They were looking for a room, but even with that explanation, the story still feels strange. One man's first home was touched by the war near its beginning. His second home became the room where the war began to end. Wilmer McLean was not chasing history. He was trying to get away from it. And that is what makes this story stay in your mind. Sometimes history does not only happen around powerful people. Sometimes it walks into the life of an ordinary man, follows him across the map, and ends up sitting in his parlor. 4. The fictional name that became a real nightmare. Edgar Allan Poe was not known for writing comfortable stories. He wrote about fear, death, and people trapped inside situations they could not escape. His stories often felt like nightmares because they did not always need ghosts to be frightening. Sometimes the horror came from human choices. In 1838, Poe published his only complete novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. The story follows a young man who stows away on a ship and goes through a series of dark and desperate events at sea. Storms, mutiny, shipwreck. The story moves from one disaster to the next. At one point in the novel, the surviving crew members are stranded on a small boat with almost no food and no rescue in sight. They are starving. Days pass, the situation becomes unbearable. Eventually, the men make a decision that was not unheard of in old maritime survival stories. They draw lots to decide who among them will be killed so the others can survive. The man who loses the draw is a young sailor. Poe gave him a name. That name was Richard Parker. In Poe's novel, Richard Parker is killed and eaten by the other survivors. It was fiction, a dark scene from a writer who was already known for imagining the worst parts of the human mind. Then, 46 years later, real life created a version that was almost too close. In 1884, a small English yacht called the Mignonette was sailing toward Australia when it sank in the South Atlantic. 4 people survived and escaped into a small boat. There was no real food. There was little hope. Days turned into weeks. Among the survivors was a 17-year-old cabin boy. His name was Richard Parker. As the men grew weaker, 2 of them made a choice that would later become one of the most famous legal cases in English history. They killed Parker and ate him, believing it was the only way they could survive. A few days later, the survivors were rescued. But the story did not end at sea. When they returned to England, the men were put on trial. The case became known as R.V. Dudley and Stevens. It forced the court to answer a terrible question. Can hunger and desperation ever excuse killing an innocent person? The court said no. The men were convicted, and the case became a major example in law, used for generations when people talk about survival, morality, and murder. That part of the story is already disturbing. But Poe's novel makes it feel even stranger. A fictional Richard Parker was killed and eaten by starving sailors in a story published in 1838. A real Richard Parker was killed and eaten by starving sailors in 1884. The gap was 46 years. The logical explanation is simple enough. Richard Parker was not an impossible name. Shipwrecks did happen. Survival cannibalism at sea was not unheard of in the 1800s. Poe was writing from a world where sailors, hunger, and disaster were real fears. But even with that explanation, the story stays uncomfortable. Poe built a dark scene from imagination. Decades later, the real world repeated it with a boy who carried the same name. Not every coincidence feels mysterious because it is beautiful. Some feel mysterious because they are too cruel to sound random. 5. The Founders' Final Fourth. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were not just 2 old presidents. They were 2 men tied to the birth of the United States. In 1776, Jefferson helped write the Declaration of Independence. Adams helped push the idea forward when independence was still dangerous, uncertain, and far from guaranteed. Together, they had helped build a country that did not exist before them. They were not always close. Over the years, they became friends, then rivals, then political enemies. Their ideas about the future of America were different, and for a long time, their friendship broke under the weight of politics. But later in life, after the anger had cooled and both men had left power, they began writing to each other again. The letters went back and forth for years. They were no longer fighting for office. They were no longer trying to defeat each other. They were old men looking back at the country they had helped create, and at the lives they had spent inside it. Then came July 4, 1826. America was celebrating 50 years since the Declaration of Independence. Across the country, people marked the day with speeches, bells, and public celebrations. It was supposed to be a day of national memory. At Monticello, Thomas Jefferson was dying. He was 83 years old. His health had been failing, and according to accounts from his final days, he seemed aware that the 4th of July was near. By midday, Jefferson was dead. Hundreds of miles away, in Quincy, Massachusetts, John Adams was also near death. Adams was 90 years old. He did not know that Jefferson had already died earlier that day. Near the end, his family remembered him speaking about his old friend. The words often given are, "Thomas Jefferson survives." But Jefferson did not survive. He had already died hours before. By the evening of that same day, Adams was dead too. Both men died on July 4, 1826, the same day, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The document they had both worked on, the moment that had defined both of their lives. The news traveled slowly in 1826, so most of the country found out over the following days. When people understood what had happened, the reaction was not just sadness. It was something closer to disbelief. Two founders had died on the same date. Not just any date, but America's birthday. And not just any birthday, but the country's 50th. Many Americans at the time felt it could not be only coincidence. They felt the date meant something. Like the country itself had somehow marked the moment. The simple explanation is age and illness. Both men were very old for their time. Both had been sick. There is no need to invent anything beyond that. But the timing is still hard to ignore. America has had many founders, but none of them left together like this. Jefferson and Adams did not die because of the date. But the date found both of them anyway. As if history wanted to close that chapter the same way it had opened it, with both names on the same page. 6. The Mission Haunted, by number 13. Apollo 13 was supposed to be another step toward the moon. By 1970, NASA had already done what once seemed impossible. Apollo 11 had landed humans on the moon in July 1969. Apollo 12 had done it again in November of the same year. Apollo 13 was next in line. Even before the mission became famous, the number made people notice. 13 has always carried a strange weight in popular culture. Hotels skip it. Airplanes avoid it. People joke about it, fear it, or pretend they do not care. NASA was not building missions around superstition. NASA was building machines, checking systems, doing math, and trusting engineering. Still, the number was there. Apollo 13 launched on April 11, 1970, at 1:13 p.m. Central Time. In military time, that is 1313. The mission was called Apollo 13. And 2 days later, on April 13, the flight changed forever. The astronauts were James Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. Their goal was to land on the moon. But about 200,000 miles from Earth, an oxygen tank exploded in the service module. Swigert sent the message back to Houston that became one of the most repeated lines in space history. He reported that they had a problem. Power was dropping, oxygen was leaking, the mission to land on the moon was over. From that moment, the mission was no longer about reaching the lunar surface. It was about getting 3 men home alive. The crew used the lunar module like a lifeboat. Engineers on the ground worked through one problem after another, trying to save power, control carbon dioxide, and guide the damaged spacecraft back to Earth. 4 days later, on April 17, 1970, the crew splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. All 3 men survived. NASA later called it a successful failure, a mission that never reached the moon but showed what human problem-solving and teamwork could do under the worst possible conditions. That is what makes Apollo 13 different from a normal bad luck story. The real danger had nothing to do with a cursed number. It came from hardware, wiring, oxygen tanks, and a chain of technical problems. NASA later traced the accident to the failure of Oxygen Tank 2. So the logical explanation is clear. Apollo 13 did not fail because of the number 13. It failed because something inside the spacecraft went wrong. But the timing still made people stare. A mission built by science became remembered with one of the most superstitious numbers in the world, sitting right in the middle of it. Apollo 13 does not prove superstition was real. If anything, it proves the opposite. And yet Apollo 13 remains the mission people remember not for reaching the moon, but for almost never coming home. The mission had 3 13s attached to it before anything went wrong. Apollo 13 launched at 1313, and disaster on April 13. The crew survived. The number stayed with the story. Whether that means anything is not for NASA to answer, but it is exactly why people still remember it. 7. The novel that predicted a shipwreck. Morgan Robertson was not a famous writer. He was a merchant sailor who had spent years working on ships before he turned to fiction. He knew the ocean the way most people know their own street. Its sounds, its moods, and its dangers. When he wrote about ships, he wrote from experience. He understood how they moved, how they were built, and how they could fail. In 1898, he published a short novel called Futility. It was not a bestseller, it did not make him wealthy or widely known. It came and went quietly, the way most books do, and Robertson moved on to other work. The story he told was about a massive ocean liner. In the book, the ship was one of the largest vessels in the world. It crossed the North Atlantic at high speed. People in the story treated it like something almost impossible to sink. And because they trusted the ship too much, it did not carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. The ship in Robertson's novel was called the Titan. Then the Titan struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic, and because there were not enough lifeboats, the disaster became deadly. Robertson wrote that in 1898, 14 years later, in April 1912, the real Titanic sank after hitting an iceberg during its first voyage across the Atlantic. More than 1,500 people died. Suddenly, Robertson's old novel looked very different. The name was close: Titan and Titanic. The danger was the same: an iceberg in the North Atlantic. The weakness was the same too: not enough lifeboats for everyone on board. That is what makes the story feel so strange. A writer had imagined a giant liner disaster years before the most famous liner disaster in history actually happened. But this is also where we have to be careful. Robertson was not just guessing in the dark. He had worked at sea, and he understood the world of ships. He knew that ocean liners were getting larger, faster, and more luxurious. He also knew that people were becoming very confident in modern engineering. So the logical explanation is strong. He did not need a vision of the future to imagine this kind of disaster. He only needed to look at where the world was already going. After the Titanic disaster, Robertson's book was republished under a title that made the connection even clearer: The Wreck of the Titan. Some versions were changed after 1912, which is why not every detail people repeat online should be trusted. That matters, because the real story does not need fake details. The true parts are already strange enough. Morgan Robertson did not predict every moment of the Titanic disaster. He did not write a perfect copy of the future, but he did write a story that came close enough to make people look twice. And sometimes that is what makes a coincidence stay alive. Not because it proves the future can be seen, but because it makes the future feel like it had already been written once before. 8. The twins who lived the same life twice. Most people think their life is shaped by the home they grow up in. That is the reasonable assumption. But the story of Jim Lewis and Jim Springer makes that idea feel less simple. In 1940, a young woman in Ohio gave birth to identical twin boys. She could not care for them, so the boys were put up for adoption and placed with two separate families. The families did not know each other. The boys were raised in different homes and grew up with no real knowledge of each other. Both families, without contact or planning, named their son James. That detail alone is easy to dismiss. James was a common name in America. Two families choosing it separately is not hard to explain. But James grew up to become Jim. And so did the other James. For most of their lives, they were strangers. Then, in 1979, they finally met. They were 39 years old. At first, the most obvious thing was their appearance. They looked alike because they were identical twins. That part made sense. But then they started talking, and the story became much stranger. As children, both had a dog named Toy. Both had worked in similar kinds of jobs. Both had married a woman named Linda, divorced, and later married a woman named Betty. One had named his son James Allan. The other had named his son James Allan. They even shared other habits and tastes, including the same cigarettes and beer. To the public, it sounded almost impossible. Two brothers raised apart had somehow grown into men whose lives looked like they had been copied from the same page. But this story is not only about coincidence. It became part of something bigger. After the two Jims were reunited, researchers at the University of Minnesota studied them and other twins who had been separated and raised in different homes. Scientists wanted to understand a hard question: how much of a person comes from the world around them, and how much comes from inside them? The simple answer is that both matter. The home matters. The people around you matter. The life you live matters. But genetics matter too. Identical twins share the same DNA, and that can shape more than just how they look. It can influence personality, habits, interests, and the way someone responds to the world. So the logical explanation is strong. Jim Lewis and Jim Springer did not live similar lives because the universe was copying one man onto another. They were identical twins, and science gives us a real reason why some of their traits and choices could turn out alike. But accepting that explanation does not make the story feel ordinary. It does not make it easy to look at two men who never grew up together and see the same names, the same habits, and the same turns appearing again and again. Their story does not prove that life is already written, but it does make one question harder to ignore. How much of who we are is chosen by us, and how much was already waiting inside us before life even began? 9. The dam's father and son. The Hoover Dam did not get built quietly. It was one of the largest construction projects in American history. Thousands of workers came to the Nevada desert in the early 1930s to build something that had never been built before. A concrete dam so large it would hold back the Colorado River. Long before the dam was finished, the project had already taken lives. On December 20, 1921, a survey crew was working near the Colorado River when a flash flood hit. One of the men was John Gregory Tierney, often called J.G. Tierney. He was swept away and drowned while helping survey the area for what would become Hoover Dam. He became one of the first deaths connected to the project. 14 years later, the dam was nearly complete. It had become one of the greatest engineering projects in American history. The river had been controlled. The concrete had been poured. The giant intake towers stood high above the water. Then, on December 20, 1935, another worker died. His name was Patrick William Tierney. He fell from one of the intake towers on the Arizona side of Black Canyon. He was the last official worker death recorded during the construction of the dam. Patrick was not just another worker. He was the son of J.G. Tierney. The father died on December 20. The son died on December 20. 14 years apart, on the same project, tied to the same river, and remembered on the same fatality list. The straightforward explanation is that Hoover Dam was dangerous work. J.G. Tierney worked in the early survey phase. His son Patrick came years later during construction. Men often followed their fathers into hard and dangerous trades during that era. And December 20 is still just one date on the calendar. That explanation is fair, but it does not make the story feel ordinary. The Hoover Dam still stands as a symbol of human engineering, but behind the concrete and the power lines, there is also a quieter story. A father and a son, separated by 14 years, both lost to the same giant work of history. And when one family name appears near the beginning and at the end of a project's fatality list, it becomes hard to hear that story and feel nothing. 10. The writer who came and left with a comet. Mark Twain spent his life turning strange timing into stories. He understood jokes, irony, and how one small detail could make a whole story feel bigger than it really was. But the strangest timing in his life was not something he wrote. It was something that happened in the sky. Mark Twain was born Samuel Langhorne Clemens on November 30, 1835, in Florida, Missouri. That same year, Halley's Comet appeared in the sky. It was not just any comet. Halley's Comet is famous because it returns again and again, roughly every 75 or 76 years. Most people only get one chance to see it in their lifetime. He grew up to become Mark Twain, one of the most read, most quoted, and most recognized American writers who ever lived. He wrote Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. He filled lecture halls across the country and across the ocean. He became the kind of person whose name outlasted his lifetime. But through all of that, he carried one strange idea about himself. In 1909, Twain knew Halley's Comet was coming back the next year. By then he was old, his health was fading, and his later years had been touched by deep personal loss. Around that time, he made one of the most famous remarks of his life. He said he had come in with Halley's Comet in 1835, and he expected to go out with it too. For most people, that would sound like a dark joke from an old writer who understood drama. But then 1910 came. Halley's Comet returned, and the world was watching. Newspapers wrote about it. Some people were excited. Some were afraid. On April 20, 1910, Halley's Comet reached perihelion, its closest point to the sun. The next day, April 24th, Mark Twain died at his home in Redding, Connecticut. He was 74 years old. The logical explanation is simple. Twain was elderly and sick. He did not die because of a comet. A comet passing through the solar system did not control his body or decide his final hour. But the timing is still hard to make feel normal. He had connected his life to Halley's Comet before it returned. He had said he came in with it, and he expected to leave with it. Then, one day after the comet reached its closest point to the sun, he died. There is a version of this story that gets exaggerated online. Some tellings make it sound like Twain somehow scheduled his own death down to the hour. That is not what happened. But the real version is already strange enough. His life began during one visit from Halley's Comet and ended during the next. It does not prove fate. It does not prove the sky was marking his life. But for a man who spent decades showing people how strange life can be, his own ending became one of his most unusual stories. Not written in a book, written across the sky, 10 moments where American history stopped feeling random. None of them prove anything supernatural. Every date, every name, every connection has a logical explanation somewhere behind it. But logic does not always make the feeling go away. And that feeling, that these moments look less like accidents and more like something arranged, is the part that stays with you. Which one felt least like coincidence to you?